After the Rachel scene and a brief detective scene we see at Leon's apartment, we are taken into another very iconic scene, which is when the replicant, Roy Batty, and Leon approach Hannibal Chew, the cyborg eye manufacturer for the Tyrell Corporation. This scene is iconic to Blade Runner fans, for this is the scene where Roy Batty misquotes the William Blake poem Jerusalem. In the movie, Roy Batty says, "Fiery the angels fell, deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of Orc." When the actual original poem says, "Fiery the angels rise, deep thunder rolled around their shores, burning with the fires of Orc." It's a curious detail that is changed here. Is Roy commenting on his imminent doom of his shortening lifespan? Or does he see himself as a demon, a fallen angel who has come back for revenge? We see in the set design of this particular scene, there's a strong blue, which, like we talked about in the previous videos, is connected to the artificial. It's connected to now the cold. We see it in the design of the space it is that these characters are in. And so it makes sense that we would have a scene that is completely illuminated in this cold blue sterile light, in a scene where we have Roy Batty really come into his own and we start to get an idea of who this character is. The environment is an external representation of who this character is. He's cold, he's sterile, he has no compassion. He's artificial, right? This is the introduction we have to him. Now, generally, this line from the poem is interpreted by Blade Runner fans as to mean that Roy is this Lucifer-type character who is coming to meet his maker and get an explanation of his existence. Something similar to like a Frankenstein story, as this is a common explanation of the character Orc in William Blake's book, Your Reason. This interpretation of comparing Roy to Orc, and Orc being a Lucifer-type character, a fallen angel, and explaining Roy in this context, it does work for the film, but I think that there is another layer of interpretation that we can find within this, which is really interesting, that I want to talk about. I found that this quote is actually a doorway to understanding the deeper influences of Philip's work, because as we will see in this video, William Blake and Philip K. Dick had a lot of similarities between the two of them, and that might be the reason why Ridley Scott, the director of Blade Runner, decided to put this quote into the film to draw our attention to the similarities between these two writers. If you don't know who William Blake is, he was a painter, illustrator, and poet during the Enlightenment era of England. I've decided to share his paintings here in this video, so that's what it is that you're seeing, and these are paintings from his book, Your Reason. Blake wrote extensively about his mystical experiences that he claimed dated back to his childhood, when he said he would be in regular communion with God, or that angels and demons would reveal themselves to him in dreams or in visions. He would then take these visions and translate them into stories that he wrote, or the paintings and illustrations that he created. Now, if you've been following this video series or my accompanying blog series on my Substack, which is in the description below, you will know about Philip K. Dick's mystical experiences, which we will refer to as the 2374 incident. This was a time in Philip's life when he started to have mystical visions after he had had a wisdom tooth removed, and he was waiting for some pain medication to be delivered to his house. When he opened the door, there was a young lady standing in front of him that was wearing a fish pendant. The light from the sun reflected off the fish pendant, and Philip K. Dick said that he was struck by this light, and he began to have this vision that Him and this woman were secret Christians living during Roman times. So this is some pretty far out stuff. But Philip K. Dick, he was so genuinely moved by this experience and by other mystical experiences that continued to happen in his life afterwards that he began to keep a journal called the Exgesis, which you can read in the description below. I'll have a link in the description below, where he talks about his experiences, and then he tries to figure out what it is that they meant. And he also talks about how it is that all of the books that he wrote for the last 10 years of his life were all influenced from these events. So if you're not familiar with the 2374 incident, I also have an R. Crumb comic that you can find that details the whole experience in the link below, and then in the description below. So you can check those out. And you can also see some explanations for it in the previous videos in this series. So here we have both of these writers openly talking about mystical experiences and how these experiences had transformed their lives, while also living in a contemporary modernist culture that believes only in the rationalism of science, that immediately labels both of these writers as crackpots. This is something that you'll notice if you go and do any research on Philip K. Dick, or if you do any research on William Blake. The context is generally that Philip K. Dick lost his mind at some point, but after reading through Exgesis, I would disagree with that. So, both of these writers were concerned with how society that is based on scientific rationalism, which promises to give us abundance and convenience into our lives, has instead led man further and further away from himself. In society, we are taught to constantly trade today for a better tomorrow. That better tomorrow is always out of reach, like a carrot in front of our face. In William Blake's poem London, he meditates on what he sees in London during the 1800s as he walks the streets, seeing the despondent and dejected people of society. The government of Blake's time had too much power and too little interest in helping those it says it serves. This is a common theme in Philip's work as well. As the first portrait of any character we see in the Blade Runner world, we see Deckard is looking for a job. And he's looking for a job in overcrowded city streets, filled with homelessness, filled with dejected and despondent population of Los Angeles. So both of these writers had the interesting parallel of being both a social critic and a mystic, an artist and a prophet. Philip painted an accurate picture of how the artificial world we have created will affect the people living within these hollow dead architectures that worship nothing, and how they will hollow out the human soul. While Blake would go on to create a new mythology of the generation of the cosmos in his book, Urizen. Both Philip and William saw the world outside of us, the five-sensory world, as a prison of Newtonian physics, rationality, and public opinion that could only be escaped through spiritual liberation through the power of the creative imagination. In the book Exgesis, this is what Philip says about his writing. Quote, "I am on a stupendous spiritual quest. It involves my total life. It involves, but is not limited to, my writing. It is Unaki whom I seek. My perception grows. It is real. It is worth the work. I have a real understanding of Unaki, and he works with me to bring this vision about. I am not working in the dark. He is with me. Finally, I am right now triumphing as I write the Archer book, not as a literary piece, but rather having to do with Unaki. Had I not turned down the Blade Runner offer, had I not tackled the Archer book, I would have lost. But he helps me. Literature is not the issue. Forging a vision of Unaki as I write is the issue. For me, there is no other issue. Pure consciousness." End quote. In Blake's book, Your Reason, he retells the Christian mythos of the genesis of the cosmos from the perspective of the god Your Reason, pronounced Your Reason, who creates the rules of the physical world that humans live in and is simultaneously imprisoned by these rules. I'm going to briefly go over the Blake mythos in this next part, but I also recommend you check out the YouTube Esoterica video in the cards above for a more in-depth breakdown of Your Reason. I do plan on doing further breakdowns of William Blake's work in another video series sometime, but Blake's work is so dense, and doing an in-depth breakdown of Blake's work right now is beyond the scope of this Blade Runner video. But let's look at the symbolism of what Orc represents in his mythology so we can draw some parallels in Blade Runner, and also to get a greater context of both Philip's work and William Blake's work. So I came across an article that analyzes William Blake's Your Reason characters, and I've included that in the link below as well. So I'm going to share a quote from that article just for brevity's sake. Quote, in Blake's mythology, Los represents the imagination and corresponds to the loving and forgiving Christ of the New Testament, as opposed to Your Reason, who according to Blake is the vengeful and repressive God of the Old Testament. Los often appears as a blacksmith with the tools of his trade. Blake sees Los crafting objects from molten metal, as he himself forged his visions and inspirations into poetry and art. The name Los may derive from the word los, alluding to fallen man's having lost paradise. It may, however, be a reversal of the Latin word sol, meaning sun, since Los is shown creating the sun on plate 73 of Jerusalem. On the right side of this picture, we see Enitharmon, Los's wife. To Blake, she represents misguided religion based on chastity and vengeance. Their child is Orc, the symbol of revolution. End quote. So if Your Reason represents the limits of our physical world, then Orc represents the revolution one goes through when they deeply connect with their intuition and become free of the chains of bondage of reason and embrace the imagination. Both writers, in the process of creating their art, retreated into their imagination and created this deep connection with God. Another writer I've mentioned on here before is a writer called Neville Goddard, who has a similar interpretation of the Bible that's worth mentioning here. His interpretation of the Bible is essentially that the Bible is an explanation that every human being is given the gift of speech and mind so that they may bring their vision into being. The vision in question being the heart desire that is given to each of us as our task to fulfill. Both of these writers had visions of grand mythological stories and the place that man played in them, and they revealed them through these stories, and in the process, the writers themselves were transformed by the work that they created. Both writers were interested in turning their attention away from the world of the senses and towards the inner eye, where the real prosperity lives. According to Neville, the prosperity that is talked about in the Bible is not the physical display of it in the form of riches or money, but is instead our connection to this endless well of the imagination. We often don't think about it this way, but the imagination is something that we can always come back to and continuously give to the world from a place of our heart desire. So there is deep connection between William Blake and Philip K. Dick. The connection being that the reason why it is that their art is so powerful and sticks with us is because it is coming from something deeper than the need to sell something or the need to impress someone. It's a complete surrendering to the muse and the vision it is that the muse gives you.